see so many people out. Boy, you'd think you were watching the news and getting a little distracted. I did check just before I stood up to see if there were any tweets in the last few minutes that might be worth noting, and I did see that 13 minutes ago, the President did tweet hailing the achievements of African Americans, particularly Frederick Douglass, who I believe he now knows is no longer with us. But I was especially glad to get the invitation to come here because my parents were hugely active in the Osher adult education series, lifelong education program where they lived at Stony Brook University on Long Island, and it was a daily thing. They taught in it, they attended classes and lectures in it, so I feel them on my shoulders, and I know that afterward they would tell me I did a great job even if I didn't. So, trying to distill thoughts in this current age, this current era of madness, is sort of like going from drinking from a fire hose to seeing if you could get it down to a trickle. There is just such a glut. We have all experienced the whiplash of news. But let's try and give some shape and order to this. If you searched the term election results after the presidential election of 2016, the top result from Google was a fake news story touting Donald Trump as the winner of the popular vote. It had 450,000 shares on Facebook. That's actually low. It probably went up much higher than that. By contrast, the official CNN election results page had only 40,000 shares on Facebook, a tenfold difference. Propaganda today is partly what comes from official sources and their media allies, and part participatory, in which we select the lies that we consume and then perpetuate. As Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have demonstrated, this official and participatory propaganda can be seamlessly and powerfully linked. Forbes magazine reports that a piece of media, real or fake, currently has a usable lifespan of a few hours and a total lifespan of 30 hours. Now consider that 60% of people share content online without reading it. So it's easy to understand why a simple phrase or a catchy headline passes as news and even truth. Half of the traffic to alt-right websites during the 2016 presidential election consisted of such shared content. So inserting incendiary and fake news into these online echo chambers creates an alternate reality, but it promotes engagement with it, and it creates a massive amount of activity that games current media algorithms. And voila, a fake news report on the election results beats out real news in Google search results. So today, the definition of truth is itself hotly contested. It used to be that if a politician lied, it could spell the end of his or her career. Today, the Washington Post estimates that Donald Trump lies on average 6 times a day. And we shrug it off. It's created a relativism that now extends to core values that we used to agree on as a civilized society. We used to agree that Nazis were bad. Beating your wife was bad. Pedophiles, I'm pretty sure they used to be on the bad list too. Other things on the list, at one time, Russia, racism, trillion-dollar public debt. Bad, bad, and bad. But that was then. Under Donald Trump, we're not so sure about anything, about what's true or what's false. So, how did we get here? How we get to a place where we don't even agree on basic truths, on basic facts? So to answer that, I'm going to break it down into 4 little subsections. First, how the corporate media itself contributed to this problem. Second, just kind of give a recent history of official propaganda. Third, I'll say a little bit about the Fox effect. And fourth, of course, we have to talk about From Russia with Love. Finally, I do want to talk about where the hope is. So, to understand the rise of Trump, we need to understand the role that the media played in creating Trump. Trump understood the media, perhaps better than the media understood itself. He is a creature of reality TV and beauty pageants. He's a showman. He knew that the key to driving ratings was a constant supply of more shocking or titillating content. So while Hillary Clinton or Trump's Republican opponents spent millions on paid media, advertisements and such, Trump famously spent almost nothing until the very end. He had something far more valuable than ads that he paid for himself. He had nonstop ads run by those who were supposed to be covering him. I saw this firsthand when Trump came to Burlington. You may remember, in January 2016, part media spectacle, part pure sort of Trump showmanship, he decides to airdrop, of course, into the heart of Bernie Sanders' country. He's going to give a speech at the Flynn Center. Naturally, there was, and so to go along with that, Chris Hayes from MSNBC decided to do a show from the bar across the street. He would do his nightly MSNBC show there and provide an alternative viewpoint, or so we thought. Hayes had, and I was at this event, Hayes had on leading lights of celebrities of Vermont. Howard Dean was going to speak. Ben and Jerry were there. Lots of folks were crowded into the bar. But as I stood in the bar, he was also going to speak to my wife, Sue Minter. So we're hanging around and we're watching what begins to unfold. So you have Chris Hayes in front of us with these chairs set up, but there's also a big TV with the image of what MSNBC is projecting to the rest of the country. So sharing a split screen, crowded under one half of the screen are our former governor and other people who were speaking about Vermont politics, and the other is an empty lectern inside the Flynn Center with a big Make America Great Again, a countdown clock. The imagery of Trump was absolutely irresistible. They were constantly cutting away to go into the Flynn Center to talk to reporters who were covering something that wasn't happening yet, which was Trump speaking. And immediately upon mounting the stage in the Flynn Center, all of the local voices, which at that point had been extremely truncated as it were silenced, and we were treated to the entire uncensored, uncut Trump speech. So I watched this and this was, as we all know, was sort of emblematic of the whole campaign, this obsessive, wall-to-wall, edge-to-edge coverage of everything Trump did. This was the weird symbiotic relationship that was also captured in the relationship between Trump and Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, who had previously been the head of NBC, where The Apprentice had been one of his prized money-making properties. So as head of CNN, the ratings shot up during the Trump campaign. In fact, by early 2016, CNN was up 40% in prime time. Trump was just too good for them to turn off, something that Trump himself boasted about. And the same was true on MSNBC and other places as well. So they began to keep running tallies of the dollar value of the free media that Trump was being given, the various advertising entities, because, of course, the ad industry was more than a little annoyed. This was a lot of lost revenue for them. Anybody want to take a guess by the end of the campaign what the dollar value of the free media was for Trump?
$1 billion.
$1 billion we have over here.
500 million.
And Al is saying 500 million. You're all much too modest. It was $5 billion in free media, dwarfing the combined value of all the media given to Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Paul Ryan, though he wasn't running for office, he was still in the news a lot, dwarfing virtually every other figure. Now, in the aftermath, a lot of these media outlets have, said mea culpas, oh, how could we, we were part of the problem. But, we need to understand that this wasn't an accident. This is part of what got us to where we were. And this is without Russia, Putin, and Fox News factoring in. This is the role that the mainstream media played in catapulting a cartoonish demagogue into the presidency of the United States. So, exploiting the media isn't really all that hard for people who understand the basic tendencies of the American corporate media, which is to act as a megaphone for those in power or for celebrities. And to be in a relationship, in a cozy relationship with the government, especially in times of war, to the point where government propaganda is indistinguishable from the kind of reporting going on the major networks. I'm going to read a little bit from a book that I wrote with my sister Amy called Static, Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back. But I was reminded of the cogency of this a couple weeks ago when, if you watch Saturday Night Live, today Alec Baldwin does this amazing Trump. Well, before Alec Baldwin and Trump, we had Will Ferrell doing George Bush. Well, Will Ferrell made a return appearance to Saturday Night Live 2 weeks ago, and he came back to, as he said, I just want to remind you how bad I was. And so with that introduction, let me share with you what we wrote about in the run-up to the Iraq War, what it was like with the way the media coverage was going. When the Bush administration launched its PR blitz to sell the Iraq War in September 2002, the American public never stood a chance of learning the truth behind the massive fraud emanating from the White House. Bush and his propaganda czars knew something the American public had not quite grasped. The American media was little more than a megaphone for those in power. This was especially true for celebrity journalists like Judith Miller, the now disgraced national security correspondent for the New York Times, and Bob Woodward, once a crusading muckraker at the Washington Post, now a father confessor to the political elite. For 3 years, the Bush administration called the tune, and the New York Times danced. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the newspaper, led by Judith Miller's dispatches, acted as a conveyor belt for the lies of Iraqi exiles, channeling their self-serving distortions right onto the front pages. Miller's sources were key players in the Iraqi National Congress, an outfit first created by the CIA and later funded by the Pentagon. Its leaders, such as Ahmed Chalabi, conjured fantastic tales about the menace posed by Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. They hinted darkly about bioweapons labs buried beneath hospitals, aluminum tubes that Iraqi dictator was intent on using to develop nuclear weapons, and the secret meetings held between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. This was propaganda in the purest sense. Disinformation that was bought and paid for by the U.S. government. The only thing needed was for respected news outlets to legitimize these fairy tales by running them as fact. The American media rose to the task and carried out the Bush administration's dirty work with gusto. The consequences of the media's abdication of its role as watchdog of democracy are now written in new front-page dispatches about the bloody quagmire in Iraq. And of course, that quagmire continues remarkably to this day. So why am I talking about something that happened then? Because this is how we laid the ground for what is happening now. Continuing on, there was, it was not just the kind of breathless coverage. And there was something that I came to call the propaganda two-step. So I referred to Judith Miller, chief national security correspondent of the New York Times, very powerful position in shaping the narrative, in shaping our understanding. We needed her. We needed the Times to be that watchdog, to be that whistleblower. But instead, what was going on was that the media was trading access for truth, or truth for access. So Judith Miller was given access to the top officials of the Pentagon, and she began providing cover, essentially. It went like this. The Bush administration had a problem. They wanted to attack Iraq, but there was no connection between Iraq and the 9/11 attacks. Those were, as we know, Saudi nationals, primarily. So there was an actual start date to the marketing campaign and the role that the media played in it. It was September 8th in 2002. Why September? Andy Card was asked. Andy Card was the chief of staff to George W. Bush. He had formerly been the chief lobbyist for General Motors. Well, Card replied to that question, why now? He said, because as we all know in the marketing business, you don't roll out a new product in August. The product they needed to sell was war. The person, a main conduit for this would be the Times, and they began giving lines to Judith Miller. They began talking about the smoking gun, about, was Saddam Hussein implicated? The smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud. Well, in that first week of September, this rollout of this marketing campaign, a headline appears in the New York Times, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud. It's Judith Miller's story, hinting darkly at all these things. And of course, if you don't have real evidence, this is, you're boxing shadows. You can never really attack any little thing. So Dick Cheney goes on the Sunday talk shows on, I believe it was September 8th. And he says, repeats this line, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud. This then was taken up by Condi Rice and others. But crucially, Dick Cheney says, don't take it from me, take it from the New York Times. And so there we have the propaganda two-step. You don't have a chance of knowing that this is all one voice, one operation. You are simply consumers of it with no way to distinguish between it. Again, the media has done its own mea culpas about the Iraq War. And, the journalists who were writing critical things, and there were staff reporters, the papers at first would say, well, we did have those critical pieces by people like Walter Pincus, the Washington Post. There are other news outlets and the McClatchy newspapers that were writing consistently critical pieces. But the other stories were buried on page, A16 or something. The front pages were reserved from those who are acting as the megaphones. So back to propaganda and how it works. There you have this kind of media role. But another problem that Bush had in the early part of his campaign was a lot of bad things were going on. Hurricane Katrina wiped out New Orleans, and the government, his administration, botched its response. A number of top officials, this may sound familiar, were being indicted and fired and exposed in scandal. So how to get the media to print positive stories? Well, maybe you just write or film the stories yourself. So here we have an operation where George Bush's, they begin funding these fake news entities. One that I cite in Static is a news account showing that the war on terror was going great. We know this because we saw an ecstatic Iraqi-American man on the evening news responding to the fall of Baghdad, quote, "Thank you, Bush. Thank you, USA. I love Bush. I love USA because they do that for Iraqi people's freedom." These remarkable testimonials, compelling narratives, all of them were fake. The stories, which aired on American news programs, were each produced by the U.S. government. The, quote, reporters were public relations professionals hired by the government, often using pseudonyms. And this was later exposed in the New York Times. And so, we have this kind of head-snapping thing where you have elements of the media exposing these things, other elements participating in these things. This was the Bush administration's version of reality TV. When they didn't like the reality, they simply created an alternate reality. We call this propaganda when we hear about it in other countries. Here, the TV networks were passing along these fantasies as news. Under the Bush administrations, at least 20 federal agencies spent $250 million creating hundreds of fake television news segments that were sent to local TV stations. The Government Accountability Office, I should say the State Department official in charge of this, they had a office known as the Office of Broadcast Services, otherwise known as the Office of BS. Well, she described these good news segments to be, quote, powerful strategic tools for influencing public opinion. The Government Accountability Office, the investigative arm of Congress, had a different name for it, quote, covert propaganda. In 4 different reports the GAO issued, they detailed how the Bush administration had broken the law. The administration's response was to instruct the heads of all government agencies in a letter to disregard the GAO findings on the covert propaganda. So we have this, and the problem is that these official pronouncements were often indistinguishable from the kind of reporting, credulous reporting that was going on at the time. Well, after faking the news, after co-opting reporters, if you still can't get a good enough image, you can just fake the reporters themselves. And that happened too. We write in a section called Fake Journalists, in Bush's alternate reality, there was no need to persuade reporters to give good press. The Bush administration simply turned to fake journalists to carry its water. That was the case with Jeff Gannon, who attended White House press conferences as a reporter for an outfit called Talon News, G-O-P-U-S-A. At a rare presidential press conference in the White House in January 2005, Bush held the fewest press conferences of any president. Bush was getting hounded by reporters over a scandal involving the payment of $250,000 to a conservative columnist named Armstrong Williams, and this got exposed. For a lifeline, he called on the guy in the 4th row with the shaved head. Jeff Gannon stood up and lobbed the president a softball question. It turns out that this journalist was in fact one James Guckert, a male escort, webmaster of gay porn sites, and the rising star for a fake news website sponsored by Texas Republican activist Bobby E. Burrell. Guckert was the perfect complement to the Bush administration's world of fake news and covert propaganda. Now they had their own puppet reporter to turn to for Republican good news when real reporters strayed off message. So this is how the ground was prepared. But it's also instructive to go back a little further in time to look at a little history of official propaganda in the United States. One of the chapters that I had the most fun researching was one we called The Mighty Wurlitzer. Some of you may be old enough to know what a Wurlitzer is or was. It was an organ used in movie houses during the silent movies or early movies to kind of create the mood. But it essentially was there to control your emotions. Well, in The Mighty Wurlitzer, we write, the cozy relationship between the corporate media and the U.S. government has not been left to chance. America's top journalists once worked closely and unapologetically with the Central Intelligence Agency, with some even on the spy agency's payroll. From the 1950s to the 1970s, more than 400 American journalists secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. This program reached its peak in the 1960s when the CIA's propaganda network included more than 800 news and public information organizations and individuals. The U.S. was in the grip of the Cold War, and the top managers of the leading news organizations enlisted as soldiers in battle. While American politicians ridiculed the notion of state-sponsored media in places such as the Soviet Union, American journalists became willing agents of their own government. Until the early 1970s, hardly a peep of surprise or protest was uttered about these arrangements. It was actually a 1977 article by the reporter Carl Bernstein in Rolling Stone that really exposed this whole operation. Among the chief executives who helped the CIA were William Paley, head of CBS, Henry Luce of Time, Arthur Sulzberger of the New York Times, Barry Bigham of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and on and on. The CIA's most valuable associations, Bernstein wrote, were with the New York Times, CBS, and Time, Inc. So the mighty Wurlitzer was the American news operation, and Bernstein described how reporters would routinely get off the boat or the plane, and their first meeting stateside from wherever it was overseas they were reporting from was with the CIA to debrief them, pick up a few tips or contacts for when they went back. And this was the news. This was the American media landscape. So let's turn to today. Now that we've done this little history lesson, which, remember, was not so long ago that we're describing here. So let me ask in this room here, with a show of hands as I mention each of these places, just to understand where you all get your news from. So first, newspapers. How many people primarily get their news from newspapers? A lot of people. NPR, CNN, Fox News, the networks, that would be ABC, NBC, CBS, Facebook, all of the above. Okay, well, so that's an interesting thing, and of course, as the this would change dramatically as the age of a room changes. Just this week, the new publisher, the New York Times, said he foresees in the very near future the end of print newspapers entirely. So let me say a word about what has come to be known as the Fox effect. In 2012, a Fairleigh Dickinson University survey reported that Fox News viewers were less informed about current events than people who didn't follow the news at all. The survey had asked current events questions like, which party has the most seats in the House of Representatives, and also asked what source of news people followed. The Fox viewers' current event scores were in the basement. This has since become known as the Fox News effect. It conjures the image of Fox News as one news outlet said, quote, a black hole that sucks facts out of viewers' heads. Yet among Americans aged 50 and older who named an objective news source, they identify Fox News by a significant margin over all other news outlets. Those younger than 50 are about as likely to name CNN, NPR, or Fox News as organizations that report the news objectively. Americans' perceptions of news media bias have increased significantly over the past generation. Just a third of people believe the news media are careful to separate fact from opinion, well below the 58% who held this view in 1984. There is a strong partisan tinge to this now. About half of Democrats, but only a quarter of independents, and just 13% of Republicans believe the media are careful to separate fact from opinion. A quarter of Democrats versus 2/3 of Republicans perceive a great deal of political bias in news coverage. Now enter the Russians. There was a very good article in Vanity Fair written over a year ago that is still remarkably cogent, that quotes a fellow named Clint Watts, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute who has studied Russian propaganda for many years. The main thrust of Russian propaganda, Watts says, is to, quote, create chaos in the system such that you don't know what is the truth or not the truth. The Kremlin does this by flooding television and digital media with biased coverage and wanton spin. The Trump administration, the article goes on, has discovered something equally effective. Lying to reporters and publicly attacking critics are like tossing grenades into the media ecosystem. The press is constantly scrambling to respond to a never-ending river of slime, and the system is gradually overwhelmed. The article goes on, over time, this chaos creates what Russian propagandists describe as the fog of unknowability. Sounds like something out of Harry Potter. Kellyanne Conway espouses, quote, alternative facts on NBC's Meet the Press. President Trump continues to insist that millions voted illegally in the general election, and the president wages war on government agencies like the CIA and the FBI to undermine their credibility as well. Objective reality splinters under the weight of falsehoods, conspiracies, and doubt, and the rules begin to change. Continuing, once this quagmire in which truth and lies are knotted up and nothing is incontrovertible is established, the final aim comes into view. Quote, you don't even know what is real information anymore, and without that, no one can hold you accountable, says Clint Watts. This is the Trump team's goal, to produce a state of disorder between themselves, the media, and the public, so that it becomes all but impossible for Trump and his team to be held accountable for conflicts of interests, shady relationship, and abuses of power. The Kremlin has provided Trump with a blueprint for ruling with impunity by way of misdirection, disorder, and political stagecraft. There's a recent book called How Democracies Die, in which they outline 4 key elements to it. Don't ask me all 4 of them. The one that stuck in my mind was the attacking and undermining of the media. One of the ways the media itself, and so you have this kind of fire coming in that direction, but I think a real weakness in, in our media is this notion of balance, or really false balance, in which you give equal weight to things that are known to be untrue should anybody state its opposite. So you have, here when we discuss climate change, despite the fact that 99% of scientists agree on it, anytime somebody makes an assertion about climate change, there is this false equivalence made with climate deniers, for whom there is virtually no support for their views. So where is the hope in this setting? And I do find hope. I've been traveling around the country on book tours and seeing remarkable resistance in small communities. The big institutions have failed many people, and so they're not leaving it to, looking to others. You have, women's marches here in Vermont, 20,000 people showing up last year. So my hope is really in the movements that are rising up to challenge this. And these are taking very concrete shape and having a very tangible impact. One is the independent media movement, and my sister's show, Democracy Now!, very much a part of that, which is nonprofit, non-corporate news. So really news that does not come with this baggage, but is told from the perspective of the grassroots, the people in the communities. And Amy and I just wrote a book along with our colleague Dennis Moynihan, looking at, it's now 20 years old. This was a show launched 20 years ago to cover the Bill Clinton election. It was supposed to be 8 months long, and the demand for it has kept increasing, and it's now around the world. So that's one area I find hope, response. Another is the press itself. Pretty late to the party, but they are discovering the importance of being a watchdog of democracy. And a credit to them that what we now see as the press in a very adversarial role to those in power should have been what it always looks like. And, you know, when we have these moments of courage, or these, as my daughter says, you shouldn't give people credit just for doing their job. That is supposed to be the job of the media, to be the fourth estate, the watchdog of those in power, but it has not been. And to the degree it has reminded us of how essential to a democracy a free press is, that's encouraging. Look at the Me Too movement. This is a movement that, you know, who would have thought? I mean, the people, the captains of industry who are falling because of the kind of behavior that has gone on for how many thousands of years? But it's taken until 2017 and 18 for there to be this accountability moment. And I would say in large part because the institutions have failed women for so long. You know, now we're peeling back the curtain on these lame ways that women were supposed to file, complaints when there were some, and discovering it's been entirely a case of, the fox guarding the hen house. In the Harvey Weinstein story, women were going through channels, filing complaints. Who was reading their complaints, we now learn? Harvey Weinstein, to decide on the merits of the case. People who work in Congress, we now learn, and none of these things would have even come to light were it not for the Me Too movement. We're filing complaints about congressmen who seem to be falling every week. And their concerns they were immediately the problem. There would be a 30-day cooling off period and required arbitration period, another 60 days. It would be months and years before ultimately those in power were given a pass. So the Me Too movement, this is remarkable. We have waited our whole lives for this level of accountability. The Black Lives Matter movement, now toppling Civil War statues. We are fighting the Civil War yet again, hopefully winning a battle this time. But these are statues that have been up for a century, that have gone unchallenged, not unnoticed, certainly not by the African American community, when you have Civil War heroes, monuments to them in the center of their towns, streets named for Klan leaders and such. This is a moment when finally those movements are having an effect. So I do think we are at a very perilous moment. I think that what is going on now with Trump is essentially a stress test for democracy. And how we come out of that, I think the press plays an essential role in whether we emerge from that stress test stronger or weaker. But I believe that these movements and the continuing, bubbling up of movements, of popular grassroots resistance, coupled with a resurgent press and an independent media, will energize this resistance and ultimately, I think, show a better way forward, and we will be stronger and better, but only if we fight back. So, thank you. I'm happy to take questions if anybody. We'll start in the front row here.
Do we have a mic, Dave?
I think we have.
Yeah. We'll pass this around. I think does this work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Actually, I have two comments. One, I was reminded by your comment about climate change. That the very same people that are sowing the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, I guess you call it, there are two sides of this story and we should consider them both, are the same people even who were sowing the two sides to the tobacco causes cancer thing years and years before. Not just the same techniques, but the same people.
Yeah.
And of course, this is very much part of exactly what you were talking about. These techniques being used.
Right.
Okay, that's the first comment. The second comment has to do with a personal experience that I had. I lived in Texas for 40 years, well, 39 years, and one of the people that I knew from our Board of Visitors at the Astronomy Department was a fellow named Bill Hobby, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Texas and the most powerful man in the Texas government, because the governor of Texas doesn't have any power at all. And I recall after 9/11, and while this ramp up to the war in Iraq was coming up, trying to convince Bill Hobby, who was no stupid person, he was smart, trying to convince him that it was impossible for Saddam Hussein to have been behind all this Al-Qaeda stuff because he was a secular guy and they were his enemies. They were his religious enemies, and it was completely obvious that they couldn't be. And therefore, all these other things must be lies too, with regard to the weapons of mass destruction and stuff.
Right.
So,
Other questions? Remember, speak right into it.
Right into it. Speaking right into
That's
it.
it.
There you go. Okay. So you have a lot of hope and a lot of faith that the media is cleaning up their act, and I don't see that. So I'm wondering. I'd love to share your optimism, but I wonder if you could maybe tell us a good story in terms of here's an example where somebody has gotten cleaned up, because I don't pretty much believe anything anymore.
So I don't want to be mischaracterized as having total faith. I think the media is only doing this under extreme duress, and only certain elements of the media. I think, the basic instincts of the American corporate media, which is to act as a megaphone for those in power and to shine all the lights on the celebrities and the powerful, is still very firmly in place. And, I should say that and those are the instincts, and it will revert to that until, Trump is doing what I tried to sketch out here is that this isn't a particularly new things going on. This was going on under Bush. The only difference between Bush and Trump is Bush was much better at it. It was smoother, it was professional, it was done, he didn't have this peculiar personal quirk of needing to stick his finger in the eye of people, personally insult people. So Trump has brought this on himself by provoking the fight. But what he's doing, he's still not at the level of what the Bush administration accomplished in selling a war based on lies. And we're still paying the price for that all these years later, 14, 15 years after that war was launched. So I think Trump keeps undermining himself, but left to its own devices, no, I don't have great faith that the American media will just do this. It's just that he keeps attacking them and insulting them, so it forces them into this role. I guess where I see the hope in this media landscape is just in the aggressive adversarial role. What we're seeing now shouldn't be the exception. It should be what we've always seen. But I don't, my fear is that Trump turns off the Twitter account and stops insulting journalists, because I think in 1 week the press would go back to the kind of role of being a conveyor belt for the messaging of those in power.
Well, I'm a retired military intelligence officer after 25 years. It's an oxymoron, military intelligence, like political science. So anyway, I had a top secret clearance for 25 years, and I could not get into any of the places where I work, whether it's the Pentagon or any place else now. But still, you have 30 people running around the White House today without security clearances. FBI did their job, reported it all by July 1st. You get an interim clearance that's supposed to only go for 20 days at the most. And there's at least 30 people that are under suspicion by the FBI for sexual assault, all kinds of assault, drugs, alcohol, money laundering, and everything else. So I just want to know what your opinion is on that, and if there's any solution, or will this come to a head? I don't think this is going away for a month, but that's just my opinion. But I'd like to know what you think.
Well, the solution is what we're seeing, not here yet, but in other places with corrupt leadership. Yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has, ruled Israel for much of for the recent, decades, or been a leading figure, is now being brought down on corruption charges. The police are finally coming to him. I mean, you can only, this kind of misbehavior, it does finally bring these guys down. Jacob Zuma in South Africa, a place I've reported from and on and written a book about, is now being removed as president against his will today or tomorrow. So, the ultimate solution is removal of the president. Whether it's impeachment or criminal charges, I guess it has to be impeachment, because criminal charges, they can't just, it's only Congress that can remove him. A friend of mine who is very involved in Republican politics, who is very dispirited, and with Trump, says the most effective thing people can do now, if they care about what's happening, is flip the House of Representatives, because they can impeach. We know that there are, it's happening all around us in the two instances I mentioned, and it can happen here. But when you have this kind of rot at the top, I don't think that Trump can be reformed. But it will take a robust media, will take energized grassroots movements, and ultimately a Congress that acts as the independent, co-equal branch of government that it's supposed to be. So all of these things can happen. We're talking about getting stars to align, but it's, look at what's just happened politically in this country for Alabama to elect a Democratic senator. We're seeing one by one, for there now to be very important in a number of states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, the gerrymandering rules getting thrown out. So many of the pillars of the current system, of the current reality, are those pillars are crumbling. So we're in a very fluid moment, and things can change, and I believe they will change.
Do you think this story will last, the security?
The security story?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean.
In other words, there's 30 people running around the White House with access to top-level secret information, and there's no defense for that. So I don't know. That's national security, but I guess it won't last.
It'll take the whole thing collapsing on itself, and already they're turning on each other. So another example, today we have Trump's lawyer, his personal lawyer, revealing that he made the $130,000 payment to the porn star
I believe that out of his own pocket.
Out of his own pocket. Anybody in the room believe that? So what is going on there? Where his personal lawyer? Now this is a lawyer. He knows the law. Well, one of the things going on is these, people save their own skins. He will be liable. The Federal Election Commission is looking at this as an illegal campaign contribution. So you're going to have enough of these insiders who are needing to save their own skin, particularly as Mueller closes in. But anyway, it's very fluid. There's no straight lines here. Mueller may be fired. All kinds of things may be happen. The head of the FBI leaders may be fired. So who knows where this is going to go? But right now, you've got presidents of other countries who are, the piper has finally come for them.